The central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord. Now let's draw a diagram imagining we're looking at the central nervous system from the front. So here we see the cerebrum from the front, and we know that the brain stem is anterior here. And we know that posteriorly we have the cerebellum. So looking at it from the front, we would see the cerebellum behind the brainstem. So cerebrum, brainstem, cerebellum. And we've also learned that the spinal cord is a continuation of the brainstem, a continuation of the medulla oblongata. And the spinal cord comes out the foramen magnum at the base of the skull, through the cervical vertebrae, through the thoracic vertebrae, and it terminates around about the level of the first or second lumbar vertebrae in most people. After that, there are large nerves which carry on down, taking nerve impulses to and from the lower part of the body. So here we have the spinal cord and some large nerves at the base of the spinal cord. But the brain and the spinal cord describe the totality of the central nervous system. And we also know that the skull is a closed vault surrounding the brain. So here we have the whole of the foramen magnum at the bottom. And the skull itself is completely surrounding the brain, the bones of the cranium, and inside that the cranial cavity. So here we have the bones of the skull. So all this is the bone. Now, in addition to the bone, the brain and the spinal cord are protected by the meninges. And the first layer of the meninges to consider is the Dura Mater. The Dura Mater is made of tough, fibrous tissue, and it surrounds the inside of the skull. So the Dura Mater is adherent to the inside surface of the cranial cavity, but it also goes down and surrounds the spinal cord, and indeed surrounds some of the nerves at the bottom of the spinal cord as well. So there we have the Dura Mater. And if you think about this in a more blown up, more detailed diagram, imagine this is the bone of the skull here. And then underneath that we have the Dura Mater. Sometimes just called the dura. Now below this, of course, we have the brain itself, the surface of the cerebrum. As we know, that's arranged in gyri and sulci. And immediately over the surface of the cerebral cortex, there is another meningeal layer that goes up the gyri and down the sulci. It follows the folds of the brain, and this is called the pia mater. Now, underneath the Dura Mater is another layer called the Arachnoid Mater. And the Arachnoid Mater, arachnoid means spidery. So this is web-like. It's like a spider's web. So it's kind of a three-dimensional layer, really, the arachnoid. There's little bits go down here onto the surface of the pia mater. And the space below the arachnoid mater, but above the pia mater, is called the subarachnoid space. And that's filled with cerebrospinal fluid. And this cerebrospinal fluid, as the name implies, surrounds the cerebrum, and it also surrounds the spinal cord. It is cerebrospinal fluid. And because it's going all the way around the brain, this essentially means that the brain is floating in cerebrospinal fluid. And this is very important because fluid is an excellent shock absorber. So when we bounce around and jump up and down, or there's some minor trauma to the head, the brain doesn't bash on the inside of the skull because the fluid cushions it, it stops it. And it's been estimated that if we had no cerebrospinal fluid, just stepping off the curb would be enough to bash the brain on the inside of the skull and knock us out, causing unconsciousness. And it's the same fluid that circulates around about the cerebrum and down the spinal cord. And in you at the moment, as an adult, probably around about 150 mils of cerebrospinal fluid. So we have the Dura Mater, Pia Mater, and in the middle the Arachnoid Mater. Collectively, these three layers, of course, form the meninges. And these are what become infected if a patient has meningitis. The Dura Mater, Arachnoid Mater, and Pia Mater. So if we go back to this diagram, we see the Dura Mater is going around the inside of the skull, protecting the brain, round about the spinal cord. Now, as well as that, there's an infold of the dura, just there, separating the two cerebral hemispheres. And this supports them. It means that the weight is supported. We mentioned before it was like eggs in an egg cup. The weight of the brain is supported by them because the brain is not a rigid structure, it needs to be supported. And if you look at the brain from the side, imagine this is the cerebrum with the occipital lobe at the back and the temporal lobe here. And the brainstem at the front leading down onto the spinal cord. And the cerebellum is just here, in this space here. And as we've noticed, the Dura Mater goes around the brain and around the spinal cord. And as well as that, there's an infold of the Dura Mater between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. This folds in. So we have a layer of tough fibrous tissue, the Dura Mater, supporting, like taking the weight of the cerebrum above and protecting the cerebellum below, and indeed protecting the brainstem below. And this infold of dura is called the tentorium. Supporting the brain, protecting the brain. And this means that the cranial cavity is compartmentalised. The area above the tentorium, this area here, is the supratentorial part of the cranial cavity, above the tentorium. And this area here, containing the brainstem and the cerebellum, below the tentorium, is the infratentorial area. So the dura surrounding the whole central nervous system, but with these two folds, infolds of the dura. And particularly important when we come to look at head injuries is this membrane here, the tentorium, separating the supra and infratentorial compartments. So here we see a picture of the brain from the front. Here we see the brain stem. This area here, spinal cord starting at the level of the foramen magnum. Here we see the cerebellum, again looking at it from the front. And this top part, of course, is the cerebrum, the left and the right cerebral hemisphere. And notice here there's areas in the brain, and these areas are actually filled with cerebrospinal fluid. They're called the ventricles. So these are the lateral ventricles, this will be the third ventricle. But they're filled with cerebrospinal fluid, making the pressure inside the brain the same as the pressure outside the brain. But here we see the line of the Dura Mater, we see the folding of the farx there. The Dura Mater going round, the folding of the Tentorium going on, and then this will carry on down and around the spinal cord.